I was sitting in a sun-drenched cafe in Tokyo with a group of my classmates, the kind of afternoon where everything just feels light and effortless. The conversation eventually drifted to the future, and one girl, while she was lazily stirring her latte, mentioned she planned to quit her job the moment she got married, just become a full-time housewife. Her friend nodded in total agreement, scrolling through a photo of a baby on her phone and casually adding a digital filter with these soft bunny ears. They spoke about changing their surnames and leaving the workforce with the same casualness you'd use to decide between ordering curry or udon for lunch. For them, there was no weight to the decision, only this quiet, unquestioned certainty. I remember just freezing, my spoon halfway to my mouth. To these women, this was a life blueprint they had carried since birth, a path that was paved with social safety nets and cultural respect that made stepping back from the world feel like a soft landing. But as I looked at that filtered baby photo, I didn't see cute. I saw my mother in rural China, her back bent over a field, her entire existence a relentless cycle of study, work, compete, survive. In my world, the rules were absolute. If you stopped running for even a second, you didn't just fall behind, you disappeared. It was a jarring, almost clinical realization. I had always believed my toughness was a badge of honor, a personality trait I'd forged through sheer ambition. But watching them, I realized their softness wasn't a choice to be weak. It was a luxury protected by a system that promised to catch them if they fell. I was a blade without a sheath, kept sharp only because I had no place to rest while they were living in a world that was built to hold them. It made me look at my own life and wonder, is our freedom really something we build for ourselves, or is it just a reflection of the ground we were born on? That reflection on the blade and the sheath really sets the stage for our entire deep dive today. The core question we're grappling with is, well, it's monumental. Does individual freedom come purely from personal ambition and grit, or is it fundamentally a reflection of the institutional architecture, the systems, the policies, the safety nets that we're born into? We're trying to move beyond just the idea of individual ambition to really dissect the complex social structures that either enable or, constrain women's choices, especially regarding career, family, and personal fulfillment in a place that's modernizing as rapidly as China.
And that's precisely where our focus is today. Our mission is to unpack this really dense historical narrative. We want to scrutinize the gender dynamics in urban China, but through the lens of institutional support, which has changed so radically over the last 5 decades. We're tracing a profound trajectory. First, you have the era of collective integrated support, then a really painful market-driven transition defined by the erosion of that support and escalating penalties for women. And third, where we are now, which is this massive coordinated effort to build a robust, comprehensive, modern safety net. This whole story is told through data mobility statistics, the hidden cost of care work, and the incredible scale of state resources now being deployed to institutionalize family support. We're tracing the explicit effort to construct that critical social sheath for the blade of female ambition.
Let's start at the beginning of that historical arc then, because the structure of the early state system is so crucial to understanding all the challenges that came after. We have to analyze the pre-reform system in urban China, the era of the Danwei.
The Danwei, or the work unit, is the absolute anchor point for this whole discussion. Before the economic reforms really took hold, the state was pursuing a kind of socialist egalitarianism. The core philosophy was that true gender equality could only be achieved by ensuring women's full, robust participation in public productive industry. The idea was, if you get women into the public workforce, you theoretically dismantle the traditional basis of gender inequality, which is rooted in private domesticity.
And the Danwei was the mechanism that didn't just employ women, it actually made it logistically possible for them to stay employed, right? By sort of eliminating that conflict between work and family.
Absolutely. The Danwei system was so unique because it fully integrated the public and private spheres. It wasn't just a place you went to work, it operated as a miniature cradle-to-grave welfare state. This integration was really the secret weapon against that work-family tension. And critically, it provided ironclad job security and rigorously prohibited gender discrimination in pay, especially within the public sector.
That's a powerful foundation. But the true genius of it, and maybe the later tragedy of its collapse, was in the direct services it provided.
The services were incredibly comprehensive. The work unit directly funded and administered things like on-site childcare, nurseries, and kindergartens. This essentially socialized domestic duties. It meant that the heavy reproductive burden didn't stop a woman from contributing economically. And the numbers, they really speak for themselves. In the late 1950s and 60s, over 90% of urban married women were employed.
90%, wow.
And the gender earnings inequality in the public sector was negligible. That level of institutional support for participation is, well, it's historically significant.
So the policies were actively forcing the Danwei to play this supporting role. These weren't just recommendations, they were mandates.
They were firm regulations. Beyond granting paid maternity leave, which was 56 days at first, later extended to 90, the guidelines explicitly required the Danwei units to fund and administer those essential childcare programs. The mandate was crystal clear. The state needed maximum labor mobilization. And the best way to get that was by reducing the domestic burden on mothers. This created a period of really unique institutional protection where women's economic activity was buffered from the demands of reproduction.
It sounds almost utopian in a way in terms of workplace support for new mothers, but this entire structure, it just came crashing down with economic marketization. So let's talk about that shift, because this is where the penalties we're going to discuss later really begin.
The reform that began in 1978 and then really accelerated into the mid-1990s fundamentally undermined the Danwei. Work units were pushed to become profit-oriented, efficiency-driven, and much less dependent on these centralized administrative mandates. They gained autonomy over hiring, pay, and even firing. The era of lifelong employment and cradle-to-grave welfare was, for all intents and purposes, over.
And of course, when a massive organization has to cut costs and become efficient, the first thing to go is always the non-pecuniary benefits, the things that don't directly produce a profit.
Precisely. The social service provisions were systematically scrapped, childcare facilities were closed, subsidized housing programs just stopped, and healthcare was unbundled from the job. This rapid structural change led to what we call the catastrophic re-separation of the public and private spheres. All of that reproductive burden, childcare, elder care, daily domestic labor was abruptly offloaded right back onto individual families. And for urban women, this created an immediate, painful, and escalating work-family conflict.
It's just so stark when you look at the scale of that infrastructure loss. I mean, the number of publicly funded kindergartens didn't just decline slightly, right? They collapsed.
They absolutely plummeted. Between 1997 and 2006, the number of publicly funded kindergartens shrank to about 1/3 of what it was before. And while you saw private fee-paying kindergartens surge, they went from providing about 13.5% of care to nearly 58%. This was no substitute for that collective benefit.
Of course not.
These were fee-based, individualized expenses. They're often unaffordable or just inconvenient for many families. And crucially, almost all of the specialized nursery care for children aged 0 to 2 years old, which is the most intensive stage, it was completely eliminated by the work units.
So the institutional protection just vanished, seemingly overnight. It left women exposed to this aggressive market economy, while at the same time they were confronting these renewed traditional expectations to manage the domestic sphere. What was the measurable hard consequence of this re-separation in the labor market?
The effect was, well, it was undeniable. We saw a dramatic drop in urban female labor force participation. It fell from 89.4% in 1990 down to 63.5% by 2005. And this is for women in their prime working ages, 21 to 50.
That's a massive drop.
At the same time, the gender earnings gap widened significantly. The female-to-male earnings ratio dropped from 86.3% in 1988 to 76.2% in 2004. This widening gap, it wasn't just market forces. It confirms that the dismantling of the Danwei system stripped away that institutional buffer. It left women vulnerable to discrimination and the crushing demands of family life, which marketization was only too happy to capitalize on.
Okay, so that sets the perfect context for understanding our second section, the empirical proof of how marriage and motherhood transformed from these socially supported roles into distinct career liabilities. We're moving from the structural change to the individual consequences, and this is backed by hard data covering that entire transition period from 1978 to 2008.
Right, and this analysis relies on retrospective data from the Chinese General Social Survey. What's so fascinating is that the data allows us to precisely map how becoming a wife and then a mother affected career trajectories in a society that was so quickly losing its support structures.
Let's start with marriage and upward mobility. Did the data confirm that just being married began to slow down career advancement for women?
It did, but it was highly gendered. The overall finding was that married individuals, in general, were less likely to achieve upward job mobility than their unmarried counterparts. That's a sort of general drag caused by increased responsibilities.
Sure, that makes sense.
But when researchers isolated the effect, the negative association between marriage and upward mobility was statistically significant only for women. For men, the statistical effect was essentially negligible.
So the act of getting married became a statistical liability for a woman's career, but not a man's. That's a painful insight. Can we quantify that? How big was that specific career drag for women?
We can. Married women's net odds of achieving upward mobility were 41.2% lower than those of unmarried women.
41%.
Yes. Think about the implications of that. Marriage immediately signaled to employers, or maybe it was internalized in the woman herself, that her focus would soon shift, or that she was less reliable for demanding roles. Meanwhile, married men experienced a much smaller, non-statistically significant reduction. The institutional environment was clearly communicating that domestic responsibilities were the wife's, not the husband's.
So if marriage slows down advancement, what about the most severe consequence, being forced out of the labor force entirely?
The statistics here are truly brutal. The study found that the net odds of job exit for married women were 2.42 times those of unmarried women. Marriage more than doubled the probability of a woman leaving her job compared to her single peers.
Wow.
And again, men showed no statistically significant correlation between marriage and labor force exit.
Wait, 2.42 times higher. That means that marriage became one of the most significant statistical indicators that a woman would lose her job. But we have to distinguish here. Were these women choosing to leave, or were they being forced to leave?
That distinction is critical, and it really drives the whole point home. When the researchers separated exits into voluntary and involuntary categories, where involuntary includes layoffs, job termination, or a family-oriented job exit, the massive gender difference was driven almost entirely by the involuntary category. The annual rate of involuntary job exit for women was 1.56,
Okay.
which is starkly higher than the 0.56 rate for men. The voluntary rates were almost identical.
So this suggests the system, having abandoned the support of the Danwei, was either laying women off first or just pressuring them to leave to fulfill family demands. It was an involuntary exit necessitated by a lack of societal support.
Exactly. That confirms that the system, which was once highly supportive, was now punishing women for fulfilling their reproductive roles. And the analysis showed this penalty only got worse as the market transition deepened, didn't it?
It did. The data allows us to track the temporal escalation. The penalties associated with marriage and motherhood became significantly more prominent in the late reform stage, specifically between 1999 and 2008.
Right, and this period was characterized by the deepest industrial restructuring, mass layoffs in state-owned enterprises, and the final demise of any remaining Danwei social functions.
The negative impact of marriage on upward mobility for women increased dramatically during this late stage. It really proves that as the institutional safety net frayed, the work-family conflict intensified to an extreme degree.
Now let's layer in dependent children, the motherhood effect itself. Did having young children, say age 0 to 6, stack yet another penalty onto these already burdened married women?
Yes, the presence of dependent children absolutely exacerbated the problem, especially once those original protections vanished. In the very early reform stage, women were still somewhat protected. But as the reforms progressed, the disadvantage of having young children became starkly evident.
So in that late reform stage?
Right. In the late reform stage, married women with young children were significantly more likely to leave the labor force. And once again, this trend was fueled by an increase in involuntary job exits. It's a double penalty. Marriage creates the initial liability, and then young children just solidify the exit.
And meanwhile, the experience for men was the exact opposite, confirming the rise of what we call the fatherhood premium.
Absolutely. In the earlier reform stages, having dependent children was, well, neutral for men's career mobility. But in the late reform stage, from 1999 to 2008, having dependent children was found to be positively associated with career advancement for men.
The classic fatherhood premium.
Exactly. Having a family signals stability, maturity, a need to provide, and that often results in better career outcomes or promotions. It's a complete inversion of the effect we saw for women in the very same institutional context.
We should also talk about the sectoral differences.
Yeah.
If the state was dismantling support in the economy in general, was there any remaining shelter?
There was, which provides critical validation for our core hypothesis about institutional support. The public sector provided more protection than the aggressive private sector. The findings showed that women were more likely to experience upward mobility and less likely to experience involuntary job exit in the public sector than in the private sector.
So those lingering structures in the public sector, even after the Danwei, they retained longer career paths and a slightly less cutthroat market logic.
But the protection wasn't just there. It was specifically more valuable for women, and that really highlights the gendered impact of the sectors.
That's the crucial nuance. The difference in career outcomes between the public and private sectors was significantly larger for women than for men. This means the public sector was acting as a critical gendered buffer against the discrimination and work-family conflict that marketization was unleashing. And as structural employment shifted away from the public sector and into the private, women became disproportionately disadvantaged. This strongly highlights how the dismantling of the state's institutional buffer was the core driver of the widening inequality, not just inherent market dynamics.
So the economic transition achieved efficiency by offloading the entire burden of reproduction and care onto the family, which severely penalized women's careers. But this uncompensated care, it didn't just disappear, it simply became invisible. And that brings us to Section 3, where we examine the sheer scale of women's unrecognized labor.
This is where we need to define the concept of the patriarchal welfare dynamic. When we look at childcare, long-term care, elder care within Chinese households, the evidence is overwhelming that this is a highly feminized sector. Chinese women are the chief unpaid contributors.
And this unpaid work is critical support for the state's welfare system overall. It's essentially plugging the gaps created by the lack of public institutional care.
Exactly. This constitutes an immense, yet uncompensated contribution. Without this invisible labor, the social stability and welfare system, especially given the pressures of an aging population and the previous collapse of Danwei services, would require exponentially higher levels of formal public funding. Women are the silent reserves of the system.
Silent reserves, I like that.
Reserves because their labor is essential, and silent because it's neither counted nor properly valued.
The core issue here is that this contribution is not recognized as a social achievement or compensated monetarily. It remains individualized and invisibilized, trapped as a private family affair. So what does patriarchal welfare state mean in this context?
It means that the system structurally validates and rewards productive labor, which is historically associated with the male public domain, while relying on, but simultaneously devaluing reproductive labor associated with the female private domain. By failing to compensate or institutionalize care work, the state reinforces traditional gender roles. It's essentially using women's unpaid time as a massive, free subsidy for public welfare and economic growth.
And this invisibility has tangible financial consequences that extend far into their later life. I'm thinking specifically about retirement security.
This is the long-term disadvantage women face. Because they have to constantly adjust their paid work to meet intensive or unpredictable care demands at home, they suffer from fragmented working hours and discontinuous career biographies. They can't maintain stable, full-time employment, and that leads directly to precarious or deficient payments into pension insurance accounts. They end up with significantly lower pension entitlements. They are the true hidden losers of the system, sacrificing their future financial security for the present necessity of domestic care.
This struggle isn't just confined to China, of course. Let's step back for a second and look at the global context regarding welfare states and gender outcomes, because there's a really complex paradox here.
Well, comparative international studies show that advanced welfare policies, think subsidized childcare, generous parental leave, they're associated with significantly higher rates of female labor force participation. This validates the idea that institutional support helps women enter the workforce. However, these same policies are also associated with higher rates of gender-linked occupational segregation.
Okay, so the system gets women into the workforce, but it often shunts them into specific, traditionally female-typed occupations, things like care, teaching, or administration, often in the public service sector itself.
That's the paradox. The expansion of public services associated with the welfare state often creates a high demand for labor in these traditionally female sectors. This expands opportunity, sure, but it can inadvertently reproduce or even widen occupational segregation. The family's reproductive burden essentially goes public, but it's women who staff the new service roles, often bypassing the higher-paying, managerial, or male-typed technical occupations.
And how does that occupational segregation affect the gender earnings gap internationally?
Well, initially, the raw data suggests that the earnings gap between men and women is generally smaller in countries with developed welfare policies. But researchers had to dig deeper. They realized that this shrinking gap was often a side effect of the overall economic structure. Advanced welfare states generally have more compressed, more egalitarian earnings distributions overall.
I see. So if every salary is closer to every other salary, the gender gap naturally shrinks.
Right. So the welfare policy wasn't directly closing the gender gap. The overall egalitarian wage structure was doing most of the work. So what happened when they controlled for that overall structure of inequality?
That's the critical insight, and it's highly relevant to China's current reforms. When researchers standardized earnings distributions to eliminate the effect of the country's general wage structure, the direct negative association between generous welfare policy and gender earnings inequality became statistically insignificant. So, in simple terms, welfare policies don't magically close the wage gap just by existing.
The policies only work if they actively combat occupational disadvantage.
Precisely. The prevalence of welfare policy was found to decrease gender earnings disparities only when researchers took into account women's occupational disadvantage, their segregation into female-typed or non-managerial fields. This means that to see real, equitable results, a progressive welfare state must not only provide institutional support, but it must also actively address the structures that channel women away from highly lucrative or managerial positions. Otherwise, that wage gap persists even with high participation rates.
That transition takes us perfectly into Section 4, the major pivot point. Having identified the exact historical penalties, that 0 to 3 childcare gap, the career instability, the resulting financial insecurity, we can now look at the massive progressive social policies being deployed today to build the robust support scaffold necessary to repair that inequality.
This is a definitive institutional response to the pain points created during that market transition. It represents a deliberate, large-scale, coordinated move across multiple ministries to institutionalize care and financial support, and the aim is to create a modern, fertility-friendly society.
The National Childcare Subsidy Scheme, which is slated for 2025, is a major pillar of this effort. This directly addresses the exact childcare gap the Danwei system left behind.
It's an unprecedented commitment. This policy provides a universal, foundational, and inclusive welfare measure. RMB 3,600 per child annually for all legally born children under the age of 3, starting January 1st, 2025. This focus on the critical 0-3 age group is so strategic, targeting the period when the burden on mothers is highest and when Danwei services completely vanished decades ago.
And the financial structure is designed to maximize its anti-poverty impact and also maintain incentives for work.
That's a key detail that really speaks to careful policy design. The subsidy is explicitly tax-exempt, and, crucially, it will not be counted as household income when they're determining eligibility for minimum living standards or poverty assistance.
So it complements, rather than cancels out, existing support.
Exactly, like the RMB 2,000 per month tax deduction for children under 3. This layering ensures that lower-income families receive the maximum benefit without jeopardizing their access to other parts of the safety net.
And the sheer fiscal commitment required for a universal policy like this is just staggering.
It requires a monumental commitment. The central government has established a special childcare subsidy support fund with an initial budget of RMB 90 billion specifically for 2025. And the central government is funding 90% of the standard subsidy, ensuring local governments have the resources to implement the scheme efficiently and on time. The implementation guidelines prioritize transparency and simple access.
Speaking of access, how easy is it for parents to actually claim this subsidy?
Well, the process is designed to be highly user-friendly and digitalized. Parents can apply primarily online through the National Subsidy Management System, but they can also use popular third-party platforms like Alipay and WeChat.
Oh, that's smart.
Or they can apply offline at their local community offices. They only need essential documents like the birth certificate and the household registration, the hukou. And importantly, they even made provisions for prorated subsidies for children born before 2025 who haven't turned 3 yet, meaning the policy immediately benefits a large existing cohort.
And beyond this direct financial support, the strategy is integrated across the entire fertility and parenting life cycle, which signals a really comprehensive state commitment.
That integration is the difference between just a single policy and a truly robust scaffold. The Ministry of Finance and the National Health Commission are coordinating massive support. For example, in health and medical care, the 2025 budget allocates RMB 5.52 billion for essential services like maternal health checkups, postnatal visits, newborn care, and birth defect screening.
And this investment has already yielded really impressive public health results. Maternal mortality is now down to 14.3 per 100,000, and infant mortality is 4.0 per 1,000, rates which are truly among the best globally.
And the insurance coverage is expanding to ease the financial risk of starting a family, specifically addressing modern fertility challenges.
The National Healthcare Security Administration has achieved a massive expansion, covering 253 million people by mid-2025. This expanded coverage includes full-cycle benefits, reimbursement for maternity medical costs, and critically, coverage for assisted reproductive technologies, or RT, in all 31 provinces.
That's huge.
It is. This policy directly addresses the intense pressure women face regarding fertility, especially older, high-achieving women who are often stigmatized by society, and streamlining the payment processes, with maternity allowances now often paid directly to families within 10 working days. That further minimizes financial stress during that crucial period.
And crucially, the policies are addressing the time constraint that drove those involuntary job exits we saw in Section 2.
The leave provisions have been substantially enhanced to address career discontinuity. Maternity leave is now extended to 158 days or more in most provinces. This is complemented by 15 days of paid paternity leave and an additional 5 to 20 days of parental leave. While the impact of parental leave on gender roles is complex globally, just providing this institutional time off is a fundamental step towards socializing the burden of early parenthood.
And the final piece of this scaffold is targeting the workplace itself. It involves organizations like the All-China Federation of Trade Unions, the ACFTU, to ensure practical implementation on the ground.
The ACFTU is vital for on-the-ground change. They have supported a massive nationwide inspection program targeting maternity protections across 86,000 employers, ensuring compliance with leave and safety laws. Furthermore, they are actively rebuilding the childcare infrastructure that was lost during the transition. They're providing RMB 22.5 million in grants from 2022 to 2024 to 300 employers offering in-house daycare.
Rebuilding the Danwei services in a way.
In a modern way, yes. They also issued the 6 Friendly Standards, setting concrete guidelines for employers to foster genuinely family-friendly work environments. Coupled with increased investment in public education and housing support for multi-child families, these actions represent a comprehensive effort to make women's diverse choices institutionally secure.
That institutional scaffold is monumental. It's an active attempt to repair the damage and vulnerabilities created by decades of sphere separation. But let's return now to the cultural reality, because institutional change happens alongside intense cultural pressure. We started with that contrast between security and struggle, the difference between Haruka in Tokyo and my mother in China.
And that cultural divide remains intense. The sources highlight that a woman's definition of freedom and happiness is often predetermined by the level of institutional promise in her environment. The contrast between Japan's softness and security and China's necessity for toughness and struggle is highly illuminating.
In the Japanese model, the institutional support validates the choice to be a full-time homemaker. It makes that choice feel like a genuine soft landing.
Exactly. For women like Haruka, that path is structurally respected. The tax system supports homemakers, and the robust medical and childcare benefits are guaranteed regardless of her employment status. This institutional security allows her the choice to step back without fear of catastrophic financial risk. Freedom in that context is found in security and that prearranged path. It allows a woman the luxury of making domestic life her priority because the state guarantees her safety.
And you contrast that with the profile of the ambitious, modern Chinese woman who often defines freedom through the ability to compete and maintain absolute independence.
That grit, that necessity for toughness, was forged by the lack of a safety net during that transition period. We see in the profile of Meiling, the logistics entrepreneur, whose success came through relentless competition and a deep understanding that no one would catch her if she failed. For the corporate climber Wei, freedom is defined by her earning power and independence. Her ambition is a shield forged in fire because slowing down or failing risks complete disappearance from the economic sphere.
The fundamental difference, as you noted, isn't the woman's effort. It's the systemic support required to turn ambition into security.
And that fierce, independent ambition, while fueling economic success, is often placed in direct conflict with traditional societal expectations, which leads to the immense pressure embodied by the leftover woman narrative, or Sheng-En-Vi.
The Sheng-En-Vi narrative is a perfect illustration of the resurgence of traditional patriarchal ideology in the modern era. The term was officially applied by the All-China Women's Federation in 2007, targeting highly educated, high-income urban women who remain single after the age of 27.
And the mass media just ran with this, heavily promoting a negative stereotype.
The term carries intensely sexist connotations, portraying these women as selfish, materialistic, and ultimately unable to find a suitable partner because of their high standards. essentially making them left behind. It's a profound gender double standard because equivalent single men are rarely stigmatized. They're often celebrated as golden bachelors or diamond single men. This just exposes the deep inequality embedded in the social discourse.
And this narrative wasn't merely a reflection of social reality, but an active, constructed discourse designed to exert pressure.
The data supports the idea that the leftover woman phenomenon is a product of media discourse construction. Given that demographic data actually shows a gender imbalance skewed toward men in certain age groups, the narrative's purpose is clearly not to reflect reality.
Right. Instead, it functions as a societal campaign aimed at discouraging women from deferring marriage and children. By pushing women to prioritize traditional family roles, it attempts to maintain a specific vision of demographic and social harmony.
And the pressure is deeply rooted in traditional patriarchal ideology and gender inequality in the marriage market itself.
Precisely. We see the strong cultural preference for age hypergamy, the traditional value that men prefer younger women. For high-achieving women, high education, age, and high socioeconomic status become distinct barriers in the marriage market. Men often prefer younger, less educated spouses who are more likely to conform to traditional roles as virtuous wives and good mothers confined to the private sphere.
So high achievement, which is lauded as a trait for men, actually becomes a career and a relationship penalty for women.
It's the cruelest form of the gender double standard. Men with higher status and education are rewarded in the marriage market, while women with the same attributes face a marriage squeeze. This just demonstrates the power of the resurgence of traditional patriarchal ideology, which often objectifies women and devalues them based on age and fertility outside of traditional family roles.
Facing this intense external pressure, modern Chinese women are caught between the weight of tradition and the pursuit of self-determination.
This internal struggle really defines the modern context. On one hand, you have women who choose to reconcile. They face intense pressure from family and the Confucian concept of filial piety, which views not having children as the most unfilial act. To placate their parents and adhere to the dominant practice of universal marriage, they might choose to give up career ambitions or drastically lower their standards for a spouse just to enter marriage.
But on the other hand, you have this growing movement of resistance and heightened self-consciousness.
This is the influence of modern egalitarian ideology. Other women are actively fighting back. They reject men who hold deeply patriarchal beliefs and are determined to seek genuinely egalitarian relationships, viewing self-sufficiency as essential. They increasingly define marriage as non-essential to their ideal life, prioritizing personal goals and professional success. Female self-consciousness has fundamentally awakened, driving them to strive for equality and demanding respect for each woman's individual choice as a critical component of sustainable social development.
So if we synthesize our findings today, the story of women's careers in modern China is an institutional story. The journey from the integrated Danwei system to the market economy resulted in a painful period of sphere separation. This created escalating career penalties, higher involuntary job exit rates, lower mobility odds upon marriage, and the reliance on women as the uncompensated silent reserves of care labor.
The ultimate realization here is that the ambitious woman, the blade, was forced to rely only on her own sharpness and grit because the institutional environment offered no place to rest. However, the current progressive and robust policies, from the massive universal RMB 3,600 childcare subsidy and the extensive RK coverage to the extended parental leave and the ACFTU's active workplace reforms, represent a decisive, coordinated institutional effort to repair the gender inequality gaps created during that market transition.
The state is actively building the scaffold required to support women's diverse aspirations. By institutionalizing care and providing financial security, the system is moving away from an environment that demanded absolute individual toughness toward one that is now actively providing that social sheath for the blade. It's enabling women to find freedom and security not just through competition, but through institutional structures that validate and respect all of their life choices.